It started as a quiet evening in a small town, where life usually moved at a slow, predictable pace. But that night something felt off. A restless energy filled the air, thick and heavy, as if the town itself was holding its breath. At the heart of it all was a dog, a loyal, grieving German shepherd named Max. Ever since his owner, Officer Daniel Carter, had passed away unexpectedly, Max had refused to leave the gravesite. No matter how much Daniel's family tried to take him home, he always found his way back. He would sit there, silent and still, his ears perked up as if listening for something. But tonight was different. Max was barking, loud, urgent, relentless. His sharp, desperate cries echoed through the cemetery, waking up nearby residents. People in town knew this dog. They knew how much he had loved Daniel, how he had never made a sound since the officer was laid to rest. So why now? Why was he barking like his life depended on it? Neighbors gathered, murmuring among themselves, their breath visible in the cold night air. Some tried to calm the dog, but he wouldn't stop. He clawed at the ground near the coffin, his body shaking with an intensity that sent chills down everyone's spine. Word spread quickly, reaching Daniel's former colleagues at the police station. Sergeant Reed, who had worked with Daniel for years, arrived at the cemetery, his face tense. He had always believed animals had instincts humans couldn't understand. And looking at Max now, eyes wild for bristling, he felt something deep in his gut. Something was very, very wrong. After a heated discussion, Daniel's family and the authorities made a difficult decision. The coffin had to be opened. It was unthinkable, even disturbing, but Max wasn't just acting out. He was trying to tell them something. With flashlights casting eerie glows over the grave, a small crew carefully began the process. The night air was thick with tension. No one spoke, their eyes locked on the wooden box as it was slowly lifted out of the earth. A strange, suffocating silence took over, broken only by Max's heavy breathing. Then, as the lid was pried open, gasps rang out. Someone stumbled backward, dropping their flashlight, the beam swinging wildly across the disturbed grave. Inside, something impossible had happened, something no one was prepared to see. And in that moment, as the truth came to light, the entire town realized that Max had been right all along. A stunned silence fell over the small crowd gathered around the grave. Flashlight beams trembled in shaky hands, casting eerie shadows over the open coffin. No one could believe what they were seeing. Max stood frozen, his ears perked, his breath ragged. He had been desperate to get them to this moment. But now that they were here, no one knew what to do next. Sergeant Reed felt his pulse hammering in his ears as he stepped closer. His years in the police force had prepared him for many things. Gruesome crime scenes, terrifying chases, gut-wrenching losses. But this was different. This was something his training couldn't explain. His fingers felt cold as he reached for his radio, but he hesitated. Who would believe this? How could he even begin to explain it? Daniel Carter had been a respected officer, a man of integrity. His sudden passing had shaken the town, leaving a void in the police department and in the hearts of those who knew him. He had been found unconscious in his home just a week ago. No signs of foul play, no warning. The doctors had called it heart failure, unexpected but not unheard of for a man in his 40s. The town had mourned, honored him with a hero's burial, and tried to move on. But Max hadn't moved on. And now, looking into that coffin, it was clear that maybe none of them should have. Daniel's body wasn't lying still, as expected. Instead, his hands were in a different position than they had been when he was buried. His fingers were curled slightly, his nails ragged, as if they had been clawing at something. The white burial gloves placed on his hands were torn, the fabric frayed at the tips. The realization sent a cold shiver through everyone watching. A muffled gasp came from Mrs. Carter, Daniel's mother, as she clutched her chest. Her son had been laid to rest in peace. And yet, looking at him now, it didn't seem like peace had ever come. Dr. Patel, the town's medical examiner, stepped forward hesitantly. She had signed Daniel's death certificate herself. There had been no reason to suspect anything unusual. No bruising, no external wounds, nothing. But standing here now, doubt started creeping in. Carefully, she reached out and touched Daniel's wrist, checking for any stiffness. Her fingers trembled slightly. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered under her breath. "There's no way." The townspeople shifted uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. Whispers spread among them. "Did they bury him alive?" Someone finally blurted out, the words cutting through the heavy night air. Mrs. Carter let out a choked sob. The thought alone was unbearable. Had her son been aware, trapped in that box beneath the earth, clawing for air, waiting for someone to hear him? The very idea made the ground beneath them feel unsteady. Sergeant Reed clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. They needed facts, not panic. He turned to Dr. Patel. "Is there a way to be sure?" His voice was steady, but even he couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. Dr. Patel took a slow breath. "There are signs we can look for, but we need to be careful." She glanced around at the crowd, then back at Daniel's body. "If something else is going on here, we need to find out what." Max let out a low, uneasy growl. His eyes stayed locked on Daniel, as if he was still expecting something. His whole body was tense, his ears flicking back and forth, listening for something no one else could hear. Sergeant Reed ran a hand over his face, trying to think. If Daniel had been buried alive, how? The hospital had confirmed his death. There had been no struggle, no evidence of foul play. Could they have made a mistake? It was rare but not impossible. Or was there something else? Something deeper, something they had all overlooked. A few of Daniel's former colleagues stood in the back, their expressions unreadable. Officer Green, who had partnered with Daniel on several cases, had been unusually quiet. He finally stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know if this means anything," he said slowly, "but the night before Daniel passed, he called me. Said he felt like someone was watching him. He was joking at first, but then he got serious. Told me he'd been feeling off for days." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the open coffin. "I told him he was probably overworked, that he needed rest." A heavy silence followed. No one had thought much of Daniel's words at the time. He was a cop, he dealt with pressure daily. Stress and paranoia weren't unusual in their line of work. But now, standing over his disturbed grave, the memory took on a different weight. Sergeant Reed exhaled sharply. "Did he say anything else?" Officer Green shook his head. "Just that if anything happened to him, I should look into it." The words sent a chill through the group. Look into it. As if Daniel had known something was wrong. Mrs. Carter sobbed harder, clinging to her younger son, who looked just as shaken. "He was healthy," she whispered. "He was fine." Dr. Patel was already examining Daniel's fingernails, her face pale. "There are scratches inside the lid," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fresh ones." Someone in the crowd swore under their breath. Sergeant Reed took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just a tragic mistake. This was something bigger. Max whined, circling the grave uneasily, his nose twitching. Then suddenly he stopped. His ears shot up. His entire body stiffened. And then, before anyone could react, he let out a single sharp bark, one filled with urgency. From somewhere in the distance, beyond the graveyard, a noise carried through the cold night air. A rustling sound, faint, almost imperceptible. But it was enough. Enough to make everyone freeze. Enough to send ice-cold fear crawling up their spines. Because Daniel Carter was supposed to be dead. And yet, at that very moment, it felt like something was still out there. The rustling sound sent a fresh wave of unease through the gathered crowd. People turned their heads, eyes darting between the trees that lined the cemetery's edge. The night was still, the air thick with something unspoken, but that noise, whatever it was, had set off an instinct in everyone. Even the most skeptical among them felt it. Max's body remained rigid, his eyes locked in the direction of the sound. His fur bristled, his chest rising and falling in short, quick breaths. He let out a low growl, his warning clear. Something wasn't right. Sergeant Reed's hand hovered near his holster. He wasn't sure why. There was no direct threat, nothing visible, but his gut told him to be ready. He took a step forward, scanning the darkened graveyard. "Who's there?" His voice was steady, controlled. The silence that followed was more unsettling than any response would have been. The flashlight beams flickered unsteadily as people moved closer together. Some muttered in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what was happening. The grave was open, Daniel's body before them, his hands bearing evidence of something horrifying. And now this sound, something or someone nearby watching. Officer Green shifted uncomfortably. "It could be an animal," he suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. He had been on the force long enough to know when a situation wasn't normal, and this was anything but normal. Dr. Patel remained by the coffin, her fingers hovering over Daniel's wrist, hesitation flickering in her eyes. She had been trained in science, in logic, in facts. But right now, none of those things seemed to apply. "Sergeant, we need to get his body back to the lab," she said quietly. "I need to do a full examination. This doesn't make sense." Reed nodded. "Agreed. But first, we need to figure out what's going on here." Max suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously toward the darkness beyond the cemetery. His body tensed as if he were ready to chase. The intensity of his reaction sent shivers through those watching. He wasn't just barking at nothing. He had been trying to tell them something all along. A man from the crowd, one of the older residents, took a cautious step back. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," he muttered. "Maybe we shouldn't have opened it." His voice trembled slightly, as if he knew something the others didn't. Mrs. Carter wiped her tears, her face pale. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, glancing around as if debating whether to speak. Finally he exhaled. "Years ago when I was a boy, there was another case like this." His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words settled over the group like a heavy fog. A man was buried, but his dog wouldn't stop crying at the grave. Days later they dug it up. He swallowed hard. Same thing. Hands torn up. Scratch marks on the lid. Dr. Patel looked up sharply. "And what happened?" The old man hesitated. "They never figured it out. No explanation. No foul play, no medical reason. The family moved away, and people stopped talking about it." He looked toward Daniel's coffin. "But those who remember, we never forgot." A chill ran through Sergeant Reed. He had lived in this town most of his life, and yet, he had never heard that story. Was it just an old man's superstition? Or had history truly repeated itself? Officer Green shook his head. "That doesn't explain anything. We need facts, not ghost stories." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. Dr. Patel straightened. "Then let's get facts. We take him back. We run tests. We figure out what really happened." Just as the conversation turned back to moving Daniel's body, another sound cut through the night. This time it wasn't a rustling. It was a distinct, deliberate sound. A step. Low. Measured. Just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. Everyone froze. Max's barking reached a fever pitch. His teeth bared, his body rigid with tension. Sergeant Reed spun toward the sound. "Who's there?" His voice was sharper now, demanding. No answer. The graveyard, once eerily still, now felt charged with something unseen. The air felt heavier. Each person standing near Daniel's grave felt an unshakable weight pressing down on them, like they were intruding on something they weren't meant to see. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed, stretching out so long that some people held their breath without realizing it. And then, the cemetery lights flickered. Once. and then they went out completely. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Flashlights shook as people instinctively backed away from the grave. Panic was close, teetering on the edge of full chaos. Max's barking stopped abruptly. And that was somehow worse. Because if Max, the dog who had sensed something wrong before anyone else, had suddenly gone quiet, then whatever was happening wasn't over. It was just beginning. The darkness swallowed the graveyard completely. People gasped, whispering in panicked voices as they fumbled with their flashlights. The air was colder now, the stillness heavier. Sergeant Reed tightened his grip on his gun, his body tense. This wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Max stood frozen, his body stiff. His ears perked toward something unseen. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His sudden silence made the fear in the air almost unbearable. If even the dog had stopped reacting, what did that mean? Officer Green clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the cemetery. The trees cast long, twisted shadows. The gravestones loomed like silent watchers, their shapes distorted by the flickering light. The only sound was the unsteady breathing of those gathered around the open coffin. "Everyone stay close," Reed ordered, his voice firm but hushed. He could feel the tension pressing in on all sides, like the very ground beneath them was holding its breath. Mrs. Carter clung to her younger son, her hands trembling. "We shouldn't have done this," she whispered. "We should have left him in peace." Dr. Patel swallowed hard. She wanted to believe there was a rational explanation for all of this. There had to be. But as she stood there, staring at Daniel's disturbed hands, at the scratch marks inside the coffin, at the absolute stillness of the night, she wasn't sure anymore. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper. Single word. "Help!" A shiver ran down every spine. Reed's blood turned ice cold. He turned sharply, shining his light toward the trees, scanning every inch of darkness. "Who said that?" he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. No one answered. The group was huddled together, every face pale, every set of eyes wide with terror. No one had spoken. No one except, "Help me," came again, this time a little stronger. And this time it was clear. It was coming from the coffin. Mrs. Carter screamed. Several people backed away, their hands flying to their mouths, their eyes filling with horror. Dr. Patel stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. "That's not possible," she whispered, her breath shaky. Max let out a sharp, desperate whine, his tail tucked, his body trembling. Sergeant Reed forced himself to move, to breathe, to push down the sheer panic clawing at his chest. He stepped toward the coffin, his heartbeat so loud he could barely hear anything else. He raised his flashlight, his shaking hands illuminating Daniel's pale face. Daniel's eyes were closed. His skin still bore the stillness of death. And yet, his lips had moved. Reed's breath hitched. "Daniel!" Nothing. Daniel's fingers twitched. A strangled cry came from somewhere in the group. More people scrambled back, some turning away, unable to watch. But Reed stayed frozen, his mind screaming that this wasn't real, that dead men didn't move, didn't whisper. And yet, right in front of him, Daniel's hand curled slightly. His mouth parted, his dry lips forming another word. "Please." The graveyard seemed to shrink around them. The cold pressed in tighter. Then a new sound. Sharp, crunching noise. Like footsteps on gravel. And they were coming closer. Reed snapped his head up, his flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught something. A figure just beyond the trees, standing at the very edge of the darkness. Not moving. Just watching. Reed's stomach twisted into a knot. He opened his mouth to demand they show themselves, but before he could speak, the cemetery lights flickered back on. Bright. Too bright. Blinding after the suffocating darkness. Gasps filled the air as people turned in every direction, searching for the figure. But it was gone. The footsteps had stopped. The night had returned to its eerie, unnatural silence. Only the coffin remained open, Daniel's hand now still. His lips parted slightly, as if he had never moved at all. As if none of it had happened. But they had all seen it. And none of them would ever forget it. A heavy silence fell over the graveyard, thick and suffocating. The bright cemetery lights buzzed overhead, almost too harsh after the overwhelming darkness from moments before. People stood frozen in place, their faces pale, their breath shallow. It felt as though the world had shifted, like they had crossed into something they were never meant to witness. Sergeant Reed turned back to the coffin. Daniel's face was unchanged. His body still, his eyes closed. But everyone had seen it. His lips had moved, his fingers had twitched, and the whisper, that faint, desperate plea for help. It hadn't been a trick of the mind. Too many people had heard it. Dr. Patel slowly knelt beside the coffin, her hands shaking as she hesitated before touching Daniel's wrist again. His skin was cold, lifeless, just as it had been before. She felt for a pulse, holding her breath. Nothing. Not a single beat. He was still dead. And yet, she looked up at Reed, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. This isn't possible. Reed swallowed hard, his gaze flicking toward the tree line where the figure had been standing just moments ago. The weight of unseen eyes still lingered, pressing against his senses. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone now. But for how long? Max let out a low whimper and backed away from the coffin, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. The dog had been relentless, barking non-stop, desperate to lead them here. And now, with Daniel lying before them, unmoving, the dog was afraid. Mrs. Carter clutched her son's arm, her hands trembling. We should leave, she whispered. We shouldn't be here anymore. Reed knew she was right. Something wasn't right with any of this. He turned to Officer Green. Get the hearse ready. We're taking him to the lab. Green nodded and hurried off, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between himself and the coffin. The others began to slowly back away too, their feet crunching against the gravel path. Single sharp gasp. Dr. Patel's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. She had been leaning over Daniel, adjusting the sheet when his chest moved. It was faint, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shallow rise, breath, a flicker of something beneath his eyelids. No, she whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. No, that's not. He's been dead for days. That's not. Daniel's fingers twitched again. Then his arm jerked. Gasps erupted around the graveyard. Several people screamed. Reed grabbed Dr. Patel's shoulder and pulled her back just as Daniel's body convulsed violently inside the coffin. His limbs seized, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out, only a strangled, breathless choke. Max let out a piercing howl and bolted from the graveyard, disappearing into the night. Mrs. Carter fainted. People turned and ran. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Daniel's body collapsed back into stillness. The cemetery fell into eerie silence again, except for the panicked breathing of those who remained. Dr. Patel pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to steady herself. She had seen bodies react before, muscle spasms, post-mortem movements, but this had been different. It wasn't random. It was purposeful, like he had been trying to wake up. Reed stood rigid, his mind racing. Logic was slipping away, crumbling under the weight of what they had just seen. He had dealt with death before. He had investigated countless cases, attended more funerals than he could count. He knew what death looked like. And Daniel didn't look dead anymore. Then a new sound cut through the night. Phone ringing. Shrill, sharp, unnatural in the graveyard's oppressive silence. Reed turned sharply. It was coming from inside the coffin. For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly Reed reached forward, his pulse hammering. He hesitated before slipping his hand inside the folds of the burial suit, searching. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Phone. But that didn't make sense. Daniel had been buried for days. How was there still battery left? He pulled it out with shaking hands and turned it over. The screen was lit. An incoming call. No number. No name. Just a single word flashing on the screen. Answer. Reed's breath hitched. His hands trembled. The others stood frozen, eyes wide, staring at the impossible sight before them. He shouldn't answer it. Everything in his gut told him not to. But against all logic, against every instinct screaming at him to stop, his thumb moved, and he answered the call. For a moment there was nothing, just dead air. Voice. A whisper. Not from the phone. From inside the coffin. Help me. Reed's grip on the phone tightened as his breath caught in his throat. The voice had been unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the phone, it was coming from inside the coffin. The others stood frozen, eyes locked on Daniel's lifeless body. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of the moment crushed down on them, an overwhelming force of fear and confusion. Then Daniel's fingers twitched again. His head shifted ever so slightly to the side. The whisper came once more, barely audible, but filled with desperation. Help me. Dr. Patel staggered backward, her medical training warring with the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing. He's been dead for days, she stammered. It isn't possible. Mrs. Carter, now conscious but pale as a ghost, clutched at Reed's arm. Tears ran down her face, her voice a shaky whisper. That's my son. My baby, he's still in there. But Reed couldn't accept that. His rational mind refused. Everything about this defied reality. A buried man couldn't be alive. A phone inside a coffin couldn't ring. And yet here they were. The phone in his hand went silent. The screen flickered. Then, without warning, it powered off completely. The battery was dead. Then Daniel's chest rose. Sharp jerking inhale. Everyone gasped. A cry of shock rippled through the remaining group. Daniel's eyelids fluttered. His mouth opened. A sound, a ragged, wheezing breath, escaped his throat. Reed moved on instinct. Get him out. Now. Officer Green and two other men rushed forward, gripping the edges of the coffin. Their hands trembled as they worked to lift Daniel's body. He was cold, unnaturally so, but as they pulled him upright, his chest rose and fell in uneven, shuddering breaths. His lips moved, but no words came out. Dr. Patel pressed her fingers to his neck. For a long moment she was silent. Then she looked up, her face pale. He has a pulse. The words sent a fresh wave of shock through the group. That's not possible, Officer Green muttered. How can he? Daniel's fingers suddenly clenched around the edge of the coffin. His head rolled forward slightly. And then, his eyes snapped open. Collective gasp. His pupils were blown wide. His gaze unfocused and distant. He looked past them, beyond them, as if seeing something they couldn't. Then his lips moved again, barely forming the words. Not me. Dr. Patel leaned in. Daniel, can you hear me? His breathing quickened. His hands shook. His lips parted again. His voice nothing more than a hoarse whisper. Not me. Reed's stomach twisted. What does that mean? Daniel's hand suddenly gripped Dr. Patel's wrist. His strength shocking for someone who had been presumed dead. His eyes, wild, frantic, finally focused on her. Not me, he rasped, his voice stronger now. It wasn't me in the coffin. Silence. The words sent a cold chill through every single person standing there. Dr. Patel's face drained of color. Daniel, you were buried. We exhumed you. His body shook. No, his voice broke. That wasn't me. His breathing became more erratic. His entire body trembling violently. I was awake. I was trapped. But I wasn't alone. Reed's throat tightened. Who was with you? Daniel's wide, terrified eyes darted to the empty coffin beside him. His breathing hitched, and then he screamed. A deep, soul-wrenching scream of sheer horror. The graveyard lights flickered again. The air turned ice-cold. Then, from the open coffin, sound. Slow, deliberate scratch. Coming from inside the lid. Except Daniel was no longer inside. And whatever was making that sound had never left. The scratch. Slow, deliberate, coming from inside the coffin where Daniel had been, where something else had been. The sound sent a ripple of terror through the group. Mrs. Carter clung to her younger son, sobbing, unable to look. Officer Green backed away. His face drained of color. Dr. Patel's hands trembled as she pressed them over her mouth, barely holding back a cry. Sergeant Reed swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward. Every instinct told him to turn around and leave, to pretend none of this had happened. But he couldn't. The scratching grew louder. Reed reached for the coffin lid, his fingers trembling. He hesitated for just a moment, taking in the looks of horror around him. Then, with a deep breath, he gripped the lid and yanked it fully open. Nothing. The coffin was empty. No body. No sign of movement. Just the deep scratches along the inside of the wood, fresh and jagged. But the sound, he had heard it. They had all heard it. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his body still trembling. "I told you," he whispered. "It wasn't me in there." Reed turned to him, his jaw clenched. "Then who was?" Daniel's hands gripped his arms as if steadying himself. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he was trying to grasp something too terrible to understand. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I felt it. When they buried me, I wasn't alone. There was something else in the dark with me." Dr. Patel stepped closer, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "Daniel, think carefully. What do you remember before you woke up?" He pressed a shaking hand to his forehead, squeezing his eyes shut. "I remember the accident," he murmured. "I remember pain, and then nothing. Just blackness." His breath hitched. "And then I woke up. But I wasn't in my body." Reed stiffened. "What do you mean?" Daniel opened his eyes, and for the first time, there was something there beyond fear, something deeper, more knowing. "I was somewhere else," he whispered. "Like I was outside myself, trapped in a place I couldn't escape. I could hear voices, muffled, distant. I could feel something beside me. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak." His voice shook. "And then I heard my own voice whispering. But it wasn't me." Mrs. Carter let out a soft sob, clutching her son as if afraid he would disappear. Reed felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "Daniel, if you weren't in your body, then who was?" Daniel looked down at the empty coffin, his breath uneven. "I don't know." The wind picked up, rustling through the graveyard, carrying a chill that settled deep in their bones. The night no longer felt silent. It felt like something was still listening, watching. Officer Green finally found his voice. "We need to go," he muttered, his hands shaking. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal." Reed couldn't argue. With careful movements, they helped Daniel to his feet. He was weak, unsteady, but very much alive. Mrs. Carter wouldn't let go of his hand, as if afraid he might disappear if she let him go. Max had returned, sitting at a distance, his ears pinned back, his eyes locked on the coffin. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just watched. As they turned to leave, Daniel hesitated. He glanced back one last time at the empty coffin, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "I don't think it's over," he whispered. Reed clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire life facing things that had explanations, things that made sense, even when they were terrible. But this was something else entirely. They left the graveyard in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. No one spoke as they drove back toward town. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken questions, lingering fear. When they reached the hospital, Dr. Patel took Daniel inside, running every test she could. His vitals were stable. His body showed no signs of decomposition, no signs that he had been underground for days. If someone had found him now, they would never believe he had been declared dead. But Daniel knew, and so did Reed. Over the next few weeks, life returned to something close to normal. The town whispered about what had happened. The graveyard workers refused to go near the site where Daniel had been buried. Some believed it was a miracle. Others refused to talk about it at all. But the real question remained unanswered. Who or what had been in the coffin with Daniel? One evening, as Reed was finishing up paperwork at his desk, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have opened the coffin." His breath stalled. Before he could respond, another message came through. "It's not over." A chill ran through him. Reed stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly turned to look out the window. The night was still, quiet. But somewhere in the distance a dog howled. And Reed knew Daniel was right. It wasn't over.